Steve Martin was right in the middle of a joke. The 300 people in the studio were laughing. 20 million Americans were laughing at home, and Johnny Carson was laughing too, until producer Fred de Cordova leaned in and whispered something in his ear. The smile on Carson's face vanished in 1 second. He reached under the desk and pulled out an envelope. An ordinary envelope. On it, in shaky handwriting, was written only for Steve. In 30 years of his career, Carson had never once interrupted a guest. But that night, February 14, 1989, right in the middle of Steve Martin's joke, he raised his hand. Steve stopped. He was still smiling, because he didn't know what else to do. "Steve," Carson said. His voice was different. That voice that turned everything into a joke was gone. "I need to read you something." The studio went silent. Steve Martin was still smiling, but his eyes weren't laughing anymore. That envelope had been mailed 3 weeks earlier from Waco, Texas. Sender: Glenn Vernon Martin, Steve's father, a man who had never given his son a single compliment in his entire life, and the words inside that envelope were about to shatter the mask of America's funniest man on live television. To understand this, we need to go back 3 weeks, to the last days of January 1989. But before that, much further back, to Waco, Texas, to the mid-1950s, to the porch of a single-story house with peeling white paint. Glenn Vernon Martin sat on that porch every evening. Korean War veteran, real estate appraiser, a man who woke at 6, came home at 6, and never spoke more than 3 sentences at the dinner table. He wasn't harsh toward his wife Mary Lee, just silent. He wasn't harsh toward his son Steve either. He just wasn't there. Physically he was there. Every evening on that porch, iced tea in hand. But Steve would say years later, "My father lived in the same house with me for 30 years, and I never got to know him. There was an invisible wall between us. I never figured out who built it." Steve Martin was funny. Born funny when he performed his first magic show at age 10, in the basement of the Waco Community Center, a room that held 40 people. Everyone applauded. Everyone except Glenn Vernon Martin. Glenn sat in the back row, arms folded, in the chair closest to the door. When the show ended, Steve ran to him. "How was it, Dad?" Glenn didn't answer. He picked up his jacket and walked to the car. Steve just stood there watching him go, the magic wand still in his hand. That scene, a 10-year-old boy watching his father walk away, shaped Steve Martin's entire career. Because after that, Steve never stopped making people laugh. Each time, bigger stages, more crowded halls. As if he hoped that if enough people laughed, the silent man in the back row would finally feel something. But Glenn never applauded. By the late 1970s, Steve Martin was the most famous comedian in America. Saturday Night Live star, the first comedian to fill stadiums. And after every success, he'd call home. Mary Lee would answer, "Your father's outside," she'd say. Or "Sure, father's asleep." Or sometimes, the most painful one, "Congratulations, son. I'm sure your father is happy too." That word, sure. Being sure meant not knowing. Glenn never picked up the phone himself. Steve Martin's relationship with The Tonight Show began in 1976. On his first appearance, Carson couldn't contain his laughter. Over the years, Steve became one of the show's most frequent guests, more than 30 times in that chair. But Carson had noticed something. Something everyone else missed. Steve Martin was a different person backstage. When the cameras stopped, that wild energy would suddenly die out. Carson first noticed it in 1981. During a commercial break, he'd found Steve alone in the hallway, leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "You okay?" Steve had smiled, that professional, automatic smile, and said, "Same as always, Johnny." Carson didn't believe him. But he didn't push, because Carson was a man of that generation too. There were questions you weren't supposed to ask, until January 1989. The last week of January. Carson's personal assistant, Drew Wilson, sorted through hundreds of letters every morning. On Friday, January 27, 1989, an ordinary envelope caught her eye in the pile. White, standard size, with Mr. Johnny Carson, personal handwritten on it. The handwriting was unsteady, like a child's or a very old person's. Sender Glenn V. Martin, Waco, Texas. When Drew opened it, she frowned. Inside was a single page, hospital stationery. A faded logo in the upper corner, Providence Health Center, Waco, Texas. The handwriting was trembling. Some words had been crossed out and rewritten. The letter was short. It didn't even fill a full page. But when Drew finished reading, her eyes had welled up. She placed the envelope on Carson's desk. She stuck a post-it note on it. "You need to read this." Carson read the letter that afternoon. His office door was closed. When he finished, he didn't move for a while. Then he took off his glasses. Carson only took off his glasses when he needed to rub his eyes. He called producer Fred de Cordova. "Fred, come to my office. Now." Fred was the Tonight Show's producer of 18 years. 70 years old. A man who'd seen every kind of Hollywood drama. But when Carson handed him the letter, Fred's face changed. "What are you going to do with this?" Carson answered, "I'm going to read it to Steve." Fred froze. "On live television?" Carson nodded. "Johnny, no. You can't destroy a man on live TV." Carson stood up, walked to the window. "Fred, Glenn Martin is dying. Emphysema. Final stage. Doctors have given him 3, maybe 4 months. And this man who never said a single kind word to his son his entire life, wrote this before dying. Wrote it even though his hands couldn't hold a pen. Wrote it on hospital paper, because he couldn't find paper at home. And he sent it to me because he can't say it to Steve's face. A man in his 70s, and he can't look his son in the eye and say this." Fred was silent. Carson turned. His eyes were red. "I've been watching that kid for 30 years. Every time he comes on, I see the same thing. A man who goes dark backstage. This letter, Steve deserves it. Glenn is going to die, and Steve will never hear this." Fred looked at the desk. "Steve will break down, Johnny. On live TV. In front of 20 million people." Carson was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, "Maybe he needs to break down, Fred. Maybe that mask needs to fall." That same week, Carson called Steve's manager Jerry Kushnick. "How's his father?" A long silence on the other end. Jerry finally spoke. "Steve doesn't talk to his father, Johnny. 7 years now." Carson closed his eyes. "Why?" Jerry sighed. "I don't know the details. Steve never opens that subject. Ever. But I know one thing. Every Christmas, every birthday, something changes in Steve's face. For 1 second. Just 1 second. Then the smile comes back. But that 1 second thing, it's like someone stabs him with a knife, and Steve pulls it out smiling." Carson put the letter in his pocket. It wouldn't leave his pocket until February 14th. February 10th, Monday. Production meeting. Carson laid out his plan. Second segment. He'd pull out the letter. Head writer Ed Weinberger objected. "It's your show, Johnny." "But it's his life." Fred grumbled. "In my entire career, we've never done anything this risky." Carson smiled. A sad smile. "Maybe we should have, Fred." February 12th. Cameraman Daniel Ferraro, 34 years old, 8 years at NBC, arrived for his shift to find whispers circulating in the control room. Fred de Cordova had gathered the camera crew and given one instruction: Tuesday night, second segment, do not turn off the cameras, no matter what. In 8 years, Ferraro had never received an order like that. February 14th, 1989. Valentine's Day. 4:30 p.m. Steve Martin arrived at the studio. Makeup artist Linda Reynolds was powdering Steve's face when he looked at himself in the mirror. "I look good today," he joked. Linda smiled. Steve smiled. That smile. For one moment, just one moment, it didn't reach his eyes. Nobody noticed. 5:15 p.m. Carson sat alone in his office reading the letter one last time. His hands were trembling. 5:30 p.m. Ed McMahon knocked on his door. Ready? Carson tucked the letter into his inner pocket. No, and I don't think I ever will be. 6 p.m. The Tonight Show theme played. Ed McMahon took the stage. Here's Johnny. Carson did his monologue, same as always. But Ferraro noticed through his viewfinder. Carson's left hand kept touching his inner jacket pocket. The letter was there. First segment went smoothly. Commercial break. Ferraro glanced at the control room. Fred de Cordova stood behind the glass, arms crossed, face tense. Back from commercial. Tonight we have a very special guest. Steve Martin. Applause erupted. Steve burst onto the stage. Energetic, wild, exaggerated beau. Sat down in the chair. Smiling. The first 5 minutes were perfect. He told a Valentine's Day joke. The studio was roaring with laughter. Carson was laughing too, maybe for the last time so freely. Then Steve moved to his second joke. My father was the kind of man who, he began. At that exact moment, Fred whispered into Carson's earpiece. Ready? Carson's face transformed. From a comedian's smile to a friend's. He raised his hand. Steve stopped. In 30 years of Tonight Show history, Carson had never interrupted a guest. Steve was still smiling, but his eyes held unease. Steve, Carson said. His voice was low, slow, almost fragile. I need to read you something. 300 people held their breath. Ferraro locked his camera on Steve's face. Close up. Carson pulled the envelope from under the desk, drew out the single-page letter. Hospital paper. This letter reached me 3 weeks ago. From Waco, Texas. The sender, he swallowed. The sender is your father, Glenn Vernon Martin. Steve's smile froze. His lips were still curved upward, but his muscles had stopped moving. The mask was cracking. Carson began to read. Please pass this to Steve. I can't say it myself. My hands don't work anymore. Nurse Barbara helped a little. Steve, I wasn't a good father. I know that. I watched you every time on that show. After Mary fell asleep, I'd turn on the television. Every time I wanted to laugh, but laughing was always hard for me. My father didn't laugh either. Neither did his father. But you laughed. You made everyone laugh. And I could never tell you this, but Carson stopped. His voice had cracked. 300 people. Silence. Ferraro's eyes had blurred behind the viewfinder, but he held the camera, no matter what. Carson continued. But I was proud. Every single time, I was proud. I didn't applaud, because I didn't know how to applaud. I didn't say it, because I didn't know how to say it. But I heard you, Steve. I heard every laugh. Steve Martin sat motionless. His left hand gripped the armrest, knuckles white. In the back rows, a woman began to sob. Ed McMahon stood at the edge of the stage, pressing a handkerchief to his face. Steve whispered, My father. Is he sick? Carson nodded. Emphysema. Final stage. Steve's shoulders dropped. In place of the smile was an expression no one had ever seen. A 10-year-old boy's face, watching his father walk away, asking, How was it, Dad? Getting no answer. A slow, respectful applause began, but Carson raised his hand. The applause stopped. Steve, there's something else. Steve looked up. His eyes were wet. On the back of your father's letter there was another note. He wrote it to me. He asked me not to read it to you. Carson paused. But I'm Carson. And some rules are wrong, Steve. He turned the paper over. Mr. Carson, don't read this to Steve, but I'm running out of time, and I wanted someone to know. I watched every one of my son's tapes, every single one, since 1976. After Mary fell asleep, I'd go down to the living room and turn the TV on low. Sometimes I rewound and watched again. Once I laughed. without making a sound. Steve was playing the banjo. And I laughed. And nobody heard. Steve Martin's hand went to his mouth. In front of 20 million people, America's funniest man began to cry silently. His shoulders were shaking. Carson stood up, walked around the desk and hugged Steve. In 30 years of The Tonight Show, he had never hugged a guest. For 11 seconds, not a sound was made. Ferraro later wrote it on the tape. 11 seconds. Then Steve, leaning against Carson's shoulder, whispered hoarsely. The microphone barely caught it. Did he laugh? Did he really laugh? Carson whispered back. He laughed, Steve, without making a sound. But he laughed. And then the truth came out. Layer by layer. The first layer opened that night. Glenn Vernon Martin had written a letter. A man who had never said more than 2 sentences to his son had picked up a pen on his deathbed. The second layer came days later. Steve had flown to Waco that night. At Providence Health Center, he found Nurse Barbara Donnelly beside Glenn, 51 years old, 23 years of experience. Barbara told him the real story behind that letter. Glenn had struggled for 3 days to write it. His hands trembled so badly that the first 2 attempts were illegible. On the 3rd try, Barbara had held his hand. She hadn't written for him, he'd written it himself, but Barbara's hand was on top of his, steadying it. He'd paused at every word. For a war veteran who had buried his emotions his entire life, that letter was a surrender. The 3rd layer went deeper. While Steve sat in his father's room, Mary Lee came to him. I need to show you something. She took Steve downstairs to Glenn's study. Under the desk in the back of a drawer, there was a shoebox, inside 14 VHS tapes, each one labeled with a date, 1976 to 1989. Glenn had recorded every one of Steve's Tonight Show appearances, every single one. Mary Lee wiped her eyes. He did the same thing every time. After Mary fell asleep, he'd go down to the living room, turn the TV on low. I knew. Every time I knew. But I never told him. It was his secret. Watching his son was his private refuge. The 4th layer was the most painful. On the 1983 tape, the recording hadn't stopped. Glenn had forgotten to turn off the television. In the last 40 seconds, there was only sound. A man sitting alone in the dark. Glenn was trying to imitate a bit Steve had just done on screen, clumsily, by himself. And then very brief, almost inaudible, a laugh. Glenn Vernon Martin was laughing. In the dark, alone, with nobody to hear. When Steve listened to those 40 seconds, he sat down on the floor. And he cried. This time there was no camera. No audience. Just a son, listening to his father's voice. The 5th layer, perhaps the quietest one, was a folded piece of paper in Glenn's desk drawer, beneath the tapes. On it, in Glenn's handwriting, a single sentence, "My son is funny." I couldn't say it. My father couldn't either. This is how this family broke. A generational chain of silence. A man who couldn't hear it from his father, and so couldn't say it to his son. Glenn had seen it. He'd written it down, but he couldn't say it. Not until death was at the door. When the commercial break came, Steve Martin didn't get up from his chair. Nobody in the studio got up. Nobody moved. Lighting technician Tommy Reeves, 28 years old, would later realize he'd forgotten to dim the stage lights, because he was crying too. Steve looked up. "Johnny, why didn't you give me this letter in private? Why here in front of everyone?" Carson thought for a moment. "Because you've been laughing in front of everyone for 30 years, Steve. Maybe you needed to cry in front of everyone just once. Maybe the mask only falls when this many people are watching." Steve flew to Waco that night. At 4:15 a.m., he walked through the doors of Providence Health Center. When he opened the door to Glenn's room, Glenn was awake. The television was on, volume low. A Tonight Show rerun was playing. Glenn was watching the moment his son had cried just hours before. Steve stood in the doorway. Glenn looked at the screen, looked at Steve, And then 70-some-year-old Glenn Vernon Martin, Korean War veteran, a man who had never hugged his son, opened his arms. Steve didn't run. He walked, slowly, and he hugged his father. Glenn's bones had thinned. His body had shrunk, but his arms held tight. That night, in that hospital room, father and son said nothing to each other. They didn't need to. The next morning, the headlines exploded. Los Angeles Times, Carson made America cry. New York Post, the funniest man in America couldn't laugh. NBC's switchboard received 4,200 calls in the first hour. The ratings were staggering. 23.4 million viewers that night, the highest Tonight Show number in 5 years. Critic Howard Rosenberg wrote, "Carson didn't do a talk show last night. He gave a son back to his father." Glenn Vernon Martin passed away on July 9, 1989. In those last 5 months, Steve flew to Waco 11 times. Every visit they watched Tonight Show tapes together. Neither of them spoke. They just watched. Sometimes the corner of Glenn's lip would curl, the closest thing to a smile. And Steve noticed every time. And every time he said nothing. Because he finally understood, silence isn't always absence. At Glenn's funeral, Steve gave a speech. For the first time in his life, he didn't make a single joke on stage. He said only one sentence. "My father used to laugh." Nobody heard him, but he laughed. Cameraman Daniel Ferraro kept that night's backstage footage for 34 years. When he retired in 2023, he delivered the tape to the NBC archives. The note he wrote on the box: "Carson was right. The mask had to fall." Steve Martin, on the last page of his 2007 autobiography, Born Standing Up, wrote about his father. "When the distance between my father and me finally closed, it took death knocking on the door for it to happen. And I still wonder, if someone had opened that envelope sooner, asked that question sooner, how many years would we have gained?" Glenn Vernon Martin laughed in the dark. Nobody heard, but in the end, Steve heard. And now I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life, a father, a mother, a friend, who you haven't spoken to in years? Someone who maybe doesn't know how to say what they feel? Don't wait for a letter. Don't wait for a hospital room. Don't wait for someone else to open the envelope for you. Pick up the phone. Drive to their door. Say the thing you've been holding back. Because Glenn Martin waited 70 years, and he almost ran out of time. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me, when was the last time you told someone you were proud of them? And if you haven't yet, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because every week we uncover stories like this, the ones that were never meant to be told, the ones that change everything. I'll see you in the next one.